In the winter of 1902, in a spot almost forgotten on official maps, there was a dirt road that simply ceased to be used after sunset. County records called it Pinefall Road. A few lines, almost always accompanied by marginal notes about impossible maintenance, constant mud, and isolation that made regular inspection difficult. For residents, however, Pinefall was not just a remote place. It was an invisible boundary between what was known and what no one bothered to explain. It was there that a man named Elias Crowder, known in the archives as the widower of Pinefall, lived for almost 15 years. Elias first appeared in the records in 1887 when he bought for a pittance a plot of land far from the nearest community. The purchase document describes the land as unsuitable for extensive cultivation, with dense forest, uneven soil, and limited access. Nevertheless, Elias built a small dark wooden house there, a low barn, and shortly thereafter an additional structure made almost entirely of reused iron sheets. On maps, it appears only as a shed. In oral accounts, it came to be called the Iron Shed. Little is known about Elias Crowder's origins. Records prior to his marriage are scarce. There is no birth certificate located with precision, only vague references to a man from the South, possibly Tennessee, who worked as a woodcutter and hunter in different regions before settling in Pinefall. In 1889, he married Margaret Crowder, a woman described in the census as reserved, in poor health, and with few social connections. The couple had only one child, who died as an infant, according to a brief death record with no specified cause. Margaret died in the summer of 1894. Once again, the cause of death was not detailed, only prolonged fever. No doctor signed the document, only 2 witnesses, both distant neighbors. From that point on, Elias was referred to in records only as a widower, and that is how he became known. The Pinefall community was small, consisting of loggers, hunters, and a few families who survived by bartering goods. Isolation created a culture of silence and self-preservation. People knew enough about each other, but they learned early on not to ask more than necessary. Elias Crowder spoke little. He only went to town when he needed to sell skins, buy ammunition, or purchase tools. He didn't drink in saloons, didn't engage in long conversations, and never accepted invitations to spend the night away from his property. He was described as polite but distant, not aggressive, not friendly. What stood out most, according to testimonies gathered years later, was his relationship with the Iron Shed. The structure did not exist when Elias arrived. It was built about 2 years after Margaret's death. Unlike the common buildings in the region, it had no visible windows. The door was heavy, reinforced with internal bars, and always remained locked. Some claimed to hear metallic sounds during the night, not screams, not voices, just sharp impacts, like tools being moved or heavy objects being dragged. None of this, taken alone, seemed sufficient to justify formal suspicions, especially since Pinefall was a place where every man looked out for himself. However, from the end of 1901, small notes began to appear in the county's hunting records. Men who went out to hunt deer near the Pinefall Road and did not return at the expected time. Initially, it was attributed to the weather, injuries, or detours common in the dense forest. But one detail was repeated. In at least 3 of these preliminary records, there is the same handwritten observation by different officers on different dates. Last known location, vicinity of the Crowder widow's property. This detail, almost lost between administrative lines and incomplete reports, was the first sign that Pinefall held something more than silence. And the archives still had much to reveal. Before the disappearances drew any formal attention, Pinefall followed a predictable, almost unchanging rhythm. The days were marked by the distant sound of axes, the creaking of wagons, and the constant wind blowing through the dense forest. At night, the lights went out early, not for economy but out of habit. In regions like this, darkness was not something to be challenged. The hunters who frequented the area came from small communities nearby. Some were young, others were experienced men, accustomed to traversing miles of forest alone. Pinefall was known for its abundance of deer and wild boar, especially in the fall. The dirt road made initial access easy, but few ventured beyond a certain point. There was a silent consensus that the forest changed after a certain bend, as if the sound was absorbed by the trees, and the path lost any clear logic. It was in this setting that Elias Crowder became a constant presence, not active, but inevitable. According to reports collected years later, he maintained a strict routine. He woke up before dawn, took care of the animals, walked the boundaries of the property, and spent long periods in the woods, always returning before sunset. He was never seen hunting at night. Never. This only caught people's attention in retrospect. Some residents recalled that Elias seemed to know trails that were not on any map. Narrow, almost invisible paths that only appeared when someone knew exactly where to step. Trails that led into the dense forest, passing very close to the iron shed, although they did not connect directly to it. The shed, incidentally, had become a point of collective discomfort. There was no clear reason for this. No specific event. Just a persistent feeling that this structure did not belong in the common landscape of the region. While barns were usually open, ventilated, with wide doors, Elias's was closed, low, and excessively solid. Iron was not a common material in rural buildings of this type, especially in such a remote place. In later statements, 2 neighbors reported that Elias avoided any approach to the shed when there were visitors. If anyone approached the fence, he would position himself so as to keep his distance from the structure. He never explained its use. He would only say briefly that he kept weather-sensitive tools there. Another recurring point in the reports concerned Elias' behavior after his wife's death. Before, although reserved, he occasionally appeared at community meetings. Afterwards, he became almost invisible. The frequency of his visits to the city decreased. His exchanges became quick. According to some, his gaze always seemed too attentive to his surroundings, as if he were measuring the time of each interaction. Even so, no one spoke openly about mistrust. The local culture did not favor this type of attitude. Questioning an isolated, widowed man in a region where everyone carried their own secrets was seen as an unnecessary risk. Furthermore, Elias was never accused of violence. There were never any reports of threats, fights, or explosive behavior. What existed were small, disconnected details. A hunter named Thomas Hale, for example, reported to a friend, and this was only recorded years later in a personal letter, that he once followed a wounded deer to the vicinity of Elias's property. According to him, the animal seemed disoriented, walking in circles, as if it had completely lost its sense of direction. Thomas claimed to have heard a metallic sound in the distance, similar to the closing of a heavy door, although he had not seen anyone. He decided to leave. Another report mentions a group of 2 brothers, frequent visitors to the region, who used to camp near the Pinefall Road. On one occasion, they returned earlier than expected. When questioned, they simply said that they didn't feel comfortable there. Nothing else. They never returned. These isolated episodes did not generate an immediate reaction. They were filed away as mere impressions, random comments, observations without concrete evidence. Elias himself continued his life without any apparent changes. He worked, negotiated, and walked along the dirt road with the same restrained demeanor. Until, in early February 1902, 3 experienced hunters decided to go beyond the point where they normally turned back. They took supplies for 2 days, and they were never seen again. In official records, this was the first time the word disappearance appeared in connection with the Pinefall Road, and from that moment on, the silence began to become too heavy to ignore. The report, dated February 18, 1902, is short, objective, and cold. 3 names, approximate ages, place of departure, and the last known note did not return to the meeting point. Nothing else. No official hypothesis. Just the observation that William Moore, Edgar Langley, and Samuel Price disappeared in the Pinefall region. All 3 were experienced hunters. 2 of them had known the road for years. None had a history of recklessness. They took enough ammunition, dry food, ropes, and a small oil lantern, which indicates that they intended to stay at least one night in the woods. The reconstruction of their last moments began days later based on indirect testimony. A local merchant confirmed that he had sold supplies to the group that morning. A boy claimed to have seen them walking along the road shortly after noon, laughing, talking, confident. The weather was stable, cold, but with no signs of a storm. The point where they left the main road was identified by recent boot prints and a light sled used to carry prey. These tracks continued into the dense forest, parallel to Elias Crowder's property. The search team was small. There was no infrastructure in that region for prolonged operations. Even so, residents volunteered. Men accustomed to the terrain, guided more by intuition than by maps. What they found was not what they expected. The footprints followed an orderly path for about 300 meters until they began to become confused. There were no signs of a struggle, no trail of blood, no evidence of an animal attack. Just footsteps that became less clear, as if the men had stopped, circled around, talked, and then dispersed in different directions for a few meters. After that, nothing. No footprints continued onward. The most disturbing detail emerged when one of the volunteers noticed older, almost faded marks crossing the site at a right angle. Footprints from other men. More than one pair, some very old, others relatively recent, all converging in some way to the same point in the woods. That point was less than 100 meters from the iron shed. The structure was closed, as always. No external signs of tampering, no noise. Elias was not found on that first day. According to neighbors, he had left early to check traps and had not yet returned. At dusk, the wind changed, the temperature plummeted, the silence became dense, almost oppressive. Some men reported a feeling that was difficult to explain. Not outright fear, but a physical discomfort, as if they were in a place where they should not remain for long. The search was suspended at dusk. The next morning, Elias Crowder appeared in town. His clothes were stained with dried mud, his face tired, his beard unshaven. He said he had heard rumors about missing hunters and offered to help if necessary. His tone was neutral. There was no obvious surprise, nor was there any exaggerated concern. When asked if he had seen anything unusual, he replied only that the woods played tricks, and that unprepared men often got lost easily. When asked about the trails near his land, he said they were old, used by loggers decades earlier. None of this was false, but something didn't add up. That same afternoon, one of the volunteers returned alone to the area near the shed. He said later that he couldn't explain why. He just felt that something had gone unnoticed. That's when he noticed marks on the ground that didn't look like footprints. They were straight, parallel grooves, as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly over the years. These grooves ended at a point where the vegetation looked younger, as if the soil had been turned over and recomposed more than once. Before he could investigate further, he heard a metallic sound coming from the direction of the shed. Not a violent impact, but the slow, deliberate sound of a lock being adjusted. The man backed away. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He just moved away, with the clear feeling that he had crossed an invisible line. That night, for the first time since the search began, someone officially recorded a comment in the county report. There are signs of recurring human activity around the Crowder property that are not consistent with common agricultural use. That was the last entry before a discovery was made at dawn the next day. An object was found near the trail, a torn strip of leather, recognized as part of William Moore's equipment. And it was clean, no signs of natural wear and tear. No animal marks, as if it had been carefully removed and left there on purpose. The discovery of the leather strip immediately changed the tone of the search. Until then, there had been talk of disorientation, accidents, perhaps a fatal separation in the woods. The object, however, did not fit these hypotheses. Hunting equipment was lost, torn, found months later in an unrecognizable state. That strip was too intact, too clean, placed in plain sight, near the trail, like a silent landmark. The report from February 23, 1902, records an unusual increase in the number of spontaneous statements. Men who, until then, had remained silent, began to report minor past experiences, things they had never considered important enough to mention. The pattern was always the same: approaching the Crowder property, feeling uncomfortable, leaving early. A neighbor stated that years earlier, he had helped Elias transport iron sheets to the property. The request was specific, that the sheets be left at a certain distance from the shed, and that he not come any closer. He said he found it strange at the time, but did not ask any questions. Another man reported that he once saw Elias burning something in the early hours of the morning. The fire was low, controlled and short-lived. It did not look like ordinary waste disposal. Local authorities began to treat the case with caution. There was no direct evidence, no body, no confession, only scattered clues, supported more by convergence than by concrete evidence. Still, they decided to formally question Elias. Elias Crowder's statement was recorded on 5 pages. He answered everything: dates, times, routines. He did not contradict himself. His version was consistent. He had not seen the hunters, had not heard anything unusual, had not received any visitors. When asked about the shed, he stated again that he kept tools and moisture-sensitive parts there. He authorized an external inspection, but claimed that the door had been stuck for weeks. The external inspection revealed nothing conclusive: no odor, no visible stains, no structural changes that would justify immediate intervention. Without a formal warrant and without direct evidence, the authorities backed down. It was then that the most delicate testimony emerged. An elderly woman, a resident of the area since her youth, asked to speak privately with the clerk. Her name appears only as an initial in the records. She stated that, shortly after Margaret Crowder's death, Elias had spent entire days without leaving the house. When he was seen again, weeks later, he was different, thinner, stiffer. According to her, Margaret was afraid of the shed. She never went near it. And shortly before she fell ill, she had commented that the iron was not for storing things but for preventing them from leaving. This testimony was never considered evidence. It was filed as a subjective account, without confirmation. The official search lasted another 2 weeks. After that, it was closed due to lack of resources and results. The 3 hunters were added to the county's list of missing persons, with the standard note, destination unknown. Elias Crowder continued to live in Pinefall for another 2 years. In 1904, his name disappeared from tax records. The property was considered abandoned. No formal sale, no declared inheritance, just abandonment. When the area was finally revisited by a new land survey, the iron shed was there. Rusty, locked, silent. There is no official record that it was ever opened. What does exist are later notes, made decades later by a local researcher, mentioning that the surrounding soil had overlapping layers of backfill, as if it had been disturbed, recomposed, and covered more than once over many years. Nothing was officially excavated. Nothing has been confirmed. But in the final case files, there is a sentence written in the margin, unsigned, probably by someone who was there and never returned the same. Some places don't hide what happened. They just wait for time to make it impossible to prove. Decades later, when Pinefall Road no longer appeared on updated maps and the forest had swallowed almost all human traces, the case of Elias Crowder reappeared only as a footnote in a regional historical survey. No photographs preserved, no objects catalogued. Just yellowed pages, written in different handwritings, spanning generations of bureaucracy and oblivion. The researcher who gathered these documents, whose name appears only in initials, described Pinefall as a place where silence was not the absence of sound, but of questions. According to him, the residents learned early on that surviving in that kind of territory required more than physical strength. It required accepting that not everything needed to be explained, as long as it remained distant. The widower's property, when finally visited again in the 1930s, was just an irregular clearing. The house had succumbed to time. The barn was nothing more than fallen boards and exposed nails. The iron shed, however, remained partially standing. The door had succumbed to rust, leaning half open as if the weight of the years itself had forced a belated surrender. The interior, according to the only description found, was empty. No tools, no personal items, no direct evidence of recent use. Only deep marks on the wooden floor, parallel scratches, repeated, concentrated in a central area. The kind of marks left by something heavy being moved countless times, always along the same path. There was no excavation. There was no formal investigation. The site was deemed structurally unstable and left as it was. Shortly thereafter, a storm knocked down what remained of the building. The names of William Moore, Edgar Langley, and Samuel Price remain on the county's missing persons records to this day. No death certificates were issued. Officially, they never died. They simply ceased to exist within the documentary boundaries of the world. As for Elias Crowder, his last concrete mention is from 1904. After that, there is no trace, no arrest, no recorded death, no confirmation of escape, just the administrative void that sometimes surrounds men who lived on the margins even when they were present. The researcher ends his account with an observation that does not attempt to conclude the case or offer definitive answers. He writes that Pinefall was not a place of explicit horror, but of prolonged normality, a setting where silent decisions were repeated for years, without witnesses, without interruptions, until the accumulation of these choices became irreversible. He suggests that the iron shed was not, in itself, the most disturbing secret. The real mystery lay in how long it took for someone to start asking questions. And perhaps, he concludes, this is the most faithful trait of that historical period. The ease with which isolation transformed ordinary men into blind spots, invisible to everyone except time. The Pinefall Road today leads nowhere. But for many years, it took men to a point where the world simply stopped registering them. And that was enough.